Now, as we all know, there's been a lot of talk in the last 6 to 12 months about innovation, research, the importance of science in Australia, building the so-called knowledge economy, all of which is great. But to further that, you need two things. You need good role models in the field and great communicators. And it's our great privilege today to have two people here as our guests who fit that bill. In 1996, Professor Peter Doherty was the joint winner of the Nobel Prize for Medicine for his work in looking at how the immune system recognises virus-infected cells. He topped that up the year later by being named Australian of the Year. He is also a National Trust Australian Living Treasure. Peter Doherty divides his time, or has for many years, between the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity in Melbourne, as well as the University of Melbourne, and the St Jude's Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, which proves that Elvis wasn't the only great thing to come out of Memphis, Tennessee. He is also, as I said, the patron of the Peter Doherty Institute, which leads us very nicely to our next special guest. Sharon Lewin is the inaugural director of the Peter Doherty Institute. Sharon, as many of you would know, has been one of the leaders in the global fight against HIV and AIDS for many years now, and she has been battling tirelessly for a cure on that front. In 2014, she was the local chair of the very well-attended International AIDS Conference here in Melbourne. She has tried to keep up with Peter in the award stakes. In 2014, Sharon was named Melburnian of the Year. And as I learnt at an event last year, she managed to achieve such an honour right here in Melbourne, despite having absolutely no interest in AFL. And she's still doing okay. We'll hear firstly from Sharon and Peter, who'll each speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, and they're more than happy to take your questions after that. So please welcome, in the first instance, Professor Sharon Lewin.
And thank you for the very kind introduction. I particularly liked the introduction about two of the smartest scientists in Australia. One big difference: Peter has the Nobel Prize, and once said he thought I would never get a Nobel Prize. I'm not going to let Peter forget that one. It also is a great pleasure and honour, of course, to speak with Peter at this event. When we were planning what we would speak about, Peter generously said, well, you go ahead and speak first and I'll just fill in the gaps, which I know he can always do very well off the cuff. So actually, it was in 1967, a widely quoted line from William Stewart, the Surgeon General of the US, when he travelled to the White House to deliver one of apparently the strongest messages ever spoken by an American public health official. And he said, it was claimed, it's time to close the books on infectious diseases, declare the war against pestilence won, and shift national resources to such chronic problems as cancer and heart disease. We all know now how wrong this was, and many of us love using this quote. But actually, I just recently read in the New Yorker that he never indeed said this. So although we use it all the time to say how wrong he was, infectious disease is so important, he was misquoted. But regardless of that, there's no doubt that all of us have been really very aware of the changing landscape of infectious diseases and how there is this real ongoing need to fund ways that we prevent, manage and hopefully cure infectious diseases. You know, just looking at the last 2 years alone, Ebola and Zika pretty much coming out, although they've been around for a while now, hitting the headlines for a range of reasons. And then WHO recently announcing the global need to do something around antimicrobial resistance. Again, a great challenge that's been with us for many years, but one we've really got to address. So I thought I'm going to speak briefly about what should and could Australia be doing about all this. Whose responsibility is it to respond to these emerging infectious diseases? And Peter will then fill in the gaps. So if you look at the causes of mortality in Australia, there's no doubt that infectious diseases have really plummeted, actually quite striking graphs. And the main drivers of that are, absolute plummeting of deaths due to tuberculosis in the 1950s, and then for young men, plummeting in deaths due to HIV over the 1990s. So the priorities for managing health in Australia have really shifted, but there are still some really important priorities around infectious diseases, and that includes antimicrobial resistance, something we're certainly not immune from. I don't think we can forget preventable infectious diseases in Indigenous populations. Incredible statistics of rheumatic fever, scabies, sexually transmitted infections that are still occurring in Australia. As responding to emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, these are the ones that are getting front page news and are incredibly important even when they happen on the other side of the world, and Peter will talk a bit more about that. And then I think a challenge that we cannot forget is preventing, managing and hopefully curing chronic blood-borne viruses, which pose totally different challenges. And they pose different challenges because they're all associated with significant stigma, a little different to some of the acute infectious diseases. They generally affect vulnerable populations. And for HIV and HBV, hepatitis B, we require lifelong treatment. So I want to speak a little bit about the recent advances in HIV and hepatitis C particularly, because it's a really exciting time in that space, and we have the opportunity in Australia particularly to totally transform the landscape around HIV and hepatitis C and potentially transform the landscape globally. So many of you may have read about the licensing of drugs for hepatitis C, an amazing story of success when you invest in scientific discovery. Hepatitis C, an incurable disease until about 3 years ago. And now we have drugs that can cure hepatitis C in 99% of people that take it with only 8 weeks of medication. The medicines cost a lot, and Australia took the very bold move on April the 1st of funding hepatitis C drugs for everyone. It was a $1 billion investment, and no other country has actually done that at that level. And so a remarkable opportunity for Australia to potentially eliminate hepatitis C. Currently, actually, of all the people living with hepatitis C, only a fraction know they're infected, only a fraction of them actually access treatment. Once you access treatment, the success rate is incredibly high. So the challenge for hepatitis C is not really so much around the science now, it's around implementation. And that's actually no mean feat, because we have to think about the ways we deliver care or raise awareness around public health. That challenge of implementation actually has been an issue in the HIV world for many years. There's been amazing innovations there too. Of course, antiviral therapy, absolutely life-saving, people now having a normal life expectancy with HIV if they take antivirals. There are issues like point-of-care testing, on-the-spot testing for HIV. Treatment simplification, there's now injectables for antivirals so that you could literally, they're not yet licensed, still in development, but an injection once every 3 months can control HIV. But the challenge is around implementing these things that we know work. In Australia, we're doing quite well. About 88% of people living with HIV know they're infected. Of those, about 84% on treatment, and about 90% have the treatments working, meaning we can't measure the virus in blood. That's a pretty stunning achievement. It's probably world best. Not many countries have been able to achieve that. But we still have about 1,000 new infections a year, and there's been no change in the numbers of new infections for about a decade. But amazing advances in that area too. PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis, that you may have read about, where people at risk of HIV, not infected with HIV, can take antiviral drugs, a bit like the pill, prevents you getting infected, and it reduces your chance of being infected by about 86%. Incredibly cost-effective intervention. And a prevention tool that could really see the end of new HIV infections. It's been just approved by the TGA here. We're awaiting approval by the PBS, meaning that it will then be funded. And if the PBS do approve it, we will be one of the first countries to actually provide PrEP nationally and for free. It's available in many other countries, but people have to pay for it. And I think this really could be transformative. I think it's really important that we can talk about the great successes in Australia, but so many other countries don't have those opportunities. If you look globally, hepatitis C, very few low-income countries have access to drugs. If you look at HIV, only about 40% of people who need treatment can access treatment. There are some amazing initiatives to bring drugs to low-income countries. Multilateral funding organisations like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, malaria and tuberculosis have done a really spectacular job of getting drugs for malaria, TB and HIV. They invest about $4 billion a year to support local programs with an estimated number of 17 million deaths averted. Australian government contributes to the Global Fund, but our contributions are decreasing. As you all know, massive cuts to Australian aid, and these are the sort of initiatives that are under threat. So I really hope that in whatever happens on July 2nd, there is reaffirmation of our continuing contributions to these global efforts. With infectious diseases, and I think Peter will emphasise this even more strongly, you can't just think about what's happening locally, we have to think globally. So when we think about funding priorities in funding research, and this is a really hot topic at the moment in Australia, and we might talk about it a bit with discussions around the Medical Research Future Fund and where that's going to place its effort, where will it get its greatest return. I do think when we think about infectious diseases, we can't just think about Australian priorities in isolation. We've got to think about how we're going to contribute to a global effort, which means investment in both the science relevant to those global threats, but also support of foreign aid. One big area we can make a significant contribution is in science and innovation. We always need better diagnostics, we need better understanding of how these infections cause disease, new vaccines and drugs, and innovative ways to engage vulnerable communities or affected communities. It's not always straightforward. And I think what we've learnt just in the last few years that each infection poses its own unique challenges. Just looking at Ebola and Zika, totally different challenges across that spectrum of scientific endeavour. And I do think we've got a hell of a lot to bring to the table. At the Doherty Institute particularly, this is the focus of the whole institute on challenging, responding, preventing, managing and curing some of these infectious diseases. And it can only be done with a multidisciplinary effort, meaning investment in the basic science, excellent diagnostics, clinical care, clinical research, and then translation into policy. So with that, I'll hand over to Peter. I'm sure he's identified the gaps, but he'll speak a lot more about particularly emerging and re-emerging diseases. Thanks very much.
So, you didn't leave me much to say, but Sharon launched with the statement from the United States Surgeon General. He wasn't unique if he did say that. We were hearing the same thing from our own Sir MacFarlane Burnett, who was a great virologist, but of course we got a big wake-up call with HIV, and then we got an even bigger wake-up call, another big wake-up call with antibiotic resistance, and so it goes on. So infectious diseases are something that the human species, in fact all vertebrate species, have to live with. They're simple, the organisms that multiply very quickly, they change very quickly, they adapt much more quickly than we do, and so we have to have preventive mechanisms, treatments and all the rest of it. And that's not ever going to change, as far as I can see. The one thing we're not in danger of is the wipeout scenario from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where everybody died because of a bug that infected telephone handsets, and the telephone handsets won't be sanitized, and of course we no longer use telephone handsets, we've all got mobiles. So we're not going to die from that. And in fact, I don't think that a global infectious disease outbreak is going to wipe out enormous numbers of human beings, but it could cause very, very significant mortality and, of course, enormous distress. Now, the Surgeon General is the head of an organisation called the United States Public Health Service, We don't have an equivalent organisation or an equivalent position in Australia. The closest we would have to the Surgeon General is Chief Medical Officer. United States Public Health Service, along with the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the people who look at the weather and climate change and all that sort of thing, are commissioned corps of the United States government. That is, they, if required to do so, they turn out in uniforms that make them look like admirals of the fleet. They actually wear what looks like a naval uniform. So they're direct US government employees. And their job is, the US Public Health Service monitors disease nationally across the United States, and they also have considerable outreach globally, because anyone involved with infectious disease, it realizes exactly what Sharon says. These are not local problems, these are global problems. Now, the United States Public Health Service, apart from having people in all the major cities right across the country, also maintains a centre called the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. This is a major laboratory. It networks across the country, networks particularly with Emory University, which is next door, and it is an extraordinary facility, and it does an enormous amount of outreach, for instance, in Ebola outbreaks in Africa and all the rest of it. CDC people there pretty much immediately. We do not have an equivalent organisation in Australia, and the closest we have to such an organisation is our new institute. Sharon, of course, is my boss. I've got two bosses. I've got Sharon, and I'm in the microbiology department. My boss is Elizabeth Hartland. And so I'm just a supernumerary, and I'm rolled out to say things occasionally when it's considered I'm not too damaging. So what have we put together at the PDI? Well, the PDI is one of the numerous jewels in the crown of Melbourne medical research. We have a number of fantastic institutions in this city. We are the newest major institution, but we're soon going to be gazumped by the new Cancer Centre, though it's not really new because it's Peter Mac moving down to where they should have always been. And so our institute is interesting. We have 8 floors of working institute. We have 3 floors of university microbiology immunology. That's the academic teaching department, the best microbiology training in Australia, with due respect to Monash. My former postdoc has just gone there to head microbiology, so they'll be improving. And no, Monash is good too, but we have an extremely good undergraduate program training microbiologists for all sorts of things, from research to diagnosis. The other 5 floors of the institute are taken up with what are largely state or federally funded operations in health. There's the diagnostic virologists, the diagnostic microbiologists, the World Health Organization Influenza Centre. That's one of 5 worldwide that monitors influenza and is part of the input that leads to the development of the new influenza vaccines every year. And we've got the Tuberculosis Centre, and we have the clinical infectious disease doctors from Melbourne and who have their research labs across with us. Now, you might think these are 2 sorts of different activities. No, they're not. They're very, very close, and this was a deliberate strategy to bring back the really applied and community-oriented aspect of infectious disease together with the academics and to bring them together. Why did we want to do that? We wanted to do that from both sides. Why? Because the new material we're getting, the new insights we're getting, a lot are coming from direct isolation of viruses and so forth from patients and bacteria. Because with new technologies, with deep sequencing technologies and new technologies for looking at responses, cytokine responses, all this sort of stuff, we now have fantastic potential to actually look at infectious disease in humans in a way that was simply not possible even 5 years ago, and we have the tremendous capacity to bring that across into the basic science. So one informs the other, and that's what we've built. It's the only institution of its type in Australia, and it's absolutely terrific. We'd love to see a national CDC. I don't think we're going to see that. As journalists, you're all familiar that there are sometimes tensions between the states and this federal sphere, that everybody has their own turf, and we're not going to disturb that. It's not worth the effort, and it would be costly. We only have 23 million people. We're not going to set up a commission corps. I'm never going to have a uniform like an admiral. Too bad. I don't need one. And so the other thing is that our new institute also provides a fantastic focus for international collaboration. My field is influenza. Influenza is, of course, always the biggest known pandemic threat because there are new viruses coming out of nature everywhere. They spread with enormous speed. The 2009 swine flu was probably in Australia before it was detected for the first time in the United States. They get around by plane very, very quickly. Not in the air handling system of the plane, but in the infected people that get flown from one place to another. And so flu goes around the world in 6 months at the most. It takes us 6 months to get a new flu vaccine out there. So it's always a threat, and we need a lot more research and all the rest of it. We've had fantastic collaborations with Shanghai and up into our north, and we're getting more and more collaboration with those regions. We have fantastic global collaborations. We have great collaborations locally. So this institute, I think, is kind of a model in a way. This is where we would do the Ebola diagnosis, the Zika diagnosis, all the rest of it. We have level 4 labs, people in spacesuits. If you saw the movie Contagion, who saw Contagion? You young guys should all see Contagion. It really tells you what an infectious disease outbreak is like, and it's actually quite realistic. You know, most Hollywood movies about scientists are really barking mad or moronic. It's actually quite good. It didn't do well because it was realistic. And everybody dies, including Gwyneth Paltrow. And you get to see the top of Gwynny's head taken off, which is quite entertaining. And for people like me, I'm a pathologist by training. And so anyway, that aside, and the other thing we're doing is we're increasingly into the Indigenous area of research, where, as Sharon said, we have, at the one time, we have urban areas which are really first world areas as far as infectious disease, and we have rural communities where the situation is really as desperate as any in the developing world. And we've had, as you know, despite enormous effort and big spending and all the rest of it, we've found it very, very difficult to research that, to reverse that. I think the best way to reverse it is to find cures and vaccines and stuff we can actually give to people. And that, I hope, is where we'll be in the new innovation agendas, whichever side of politics actually wins. And the New Medical Research Future Fund is certainly an important part of that, as is keeping the funding up for the National Health and Medical Research Council. And I would also say, as journalist, put in advocacy for the Australia Research Council. Governments sort of get the idea that the Australia Research Council research is all sort of off the edge or something. It's not. We have as much collaboration with chemists and physicists and people working funded by the Australia Research Council as we have within the medical research community. If you take, for instance, I'm currently chair of one of the nanotechnology drug-related centres of excellence, ARC centres of excellence, that's looking at drug delivery, vaccine delivery using nano. That's Australia Research Council, and it draws on an enormous spread of expertise which is outside the normal medical area. So as journalists, if you can go into bat for the NHMRC, the ARC, for research in general, just say what wonderful people we are. If you don't believe it of me, Sharon's obviously terrific. And if you want to hear from more people in future, we've got a fantastic depth of really interesting people at our institute that will happily come and talk to you if we bully them hard enough. Thanks.
Sure they did. Now please, if you have a question to ask either Peter or Sharon, please raise your hand to say who you are, and if you are with an organisation, please say that. But while the microphone goes there, I want to pick up on something you said, Peter. How hard, how challenging is it for scientists to keep up with, say, fast mutating influenza viruses? The vaccines seem to change every year. How much of a challenge for the scientific community is that?
We can't. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion that we should be, on the part of basically molecular epidemiologists, informatics type people, that we should be able to make predictions. I don't believe we can, quite frankly. And if you look at the latest influenza that's caused a real problem in China, crossing from birds to humans, but fortunately not going between humans, it's an H7N9. I'd never even heard of an H7N9 virus in 30 years working. There's an enormous range of these viruses. We have to some extent, to be reactive. But what a lot of influenza research is oriented towards is, firstly, the idea, and this is also in the AIDS world, trying to make a vaccine that is cross-reactive right across all the influenza strains. Now, whether we can make that work or not, we don't know. We do know that there are antibodies which will cross-react for HIV. We know that there are other antibodies that will cross-react for all the flus. The problem is trying to get people to make them because of the way that immune response is set up. But the other angle, and that has been enormously successful in biomedical research as far as viruses are concerned, and that is designing much better drug therapies, that are much less likely to, where we're less likely to get escape. So with HIV, of course, we've so far failed with making a vaccine, but we've done fantastically well with making drugs. And the same is true of Hep C. The treatment is as a small molecule. And so with flu, you maybe heard Tamiflu, Relenza. There are now a whole lot more drugs that are in development or actually being used. And what we really need in these situations is to use 2 drugs that target different parts of the virus life cycle. With HIV, they use 3. That stops the mutants coming forward.
Thank you both for an excellent talk. My question is about antibiotics. My name's John Allen. I'm from the Royal District Nursing Service and also the Melbourne Press Club. I'm particularly interested in where we're at on the antibiotic scale, for want of a better word. If, say, 0 is nothing to worry about and 10 is dire, where are we now with antibiotics, and what sort of work is going on to assure that future generations are going to be okay? Second, and also allied to that is, if there is a problem with antibiotics, is it crop farming, is it caused by animal farming, or what? I'm just very interested in your response. Thank you.
So I might respond to that. On a scale of 0 to 10, I'd put at about 5 to 6, with a risk of it going higher unless we do something. And there's a lot that we can do. Just like any infectious diseases, prevention is always better than treatment, always better. And there's a lot of ways to prevent antimicrobial resistance. And one of the best ways is appropriate use of antibiotics, both in the community and in hospitals. And there's been an increasing recognition of this, and what's called antibiotic stewardship, where you regulate the use of antibiotics. They've been doing it for years in Scandinavia and have had extremely low rates of antimicrobial resistance going along for decades. What gets in the way, though, is that infectious diseases know no borders. So if you can easily get, and you've probably read about this, you can be travelling in India and or a country that has less regulation of antibiotics, and you can get infected with one of these highly resistant germs that may cause no problem until you get another illness. So we have to respond to this globally. We may have quite good things in place in Australia. We can still do better on stewardship, but it needs to be a global effort. And it's the WHO that have now really taken this on, because you do need to strengthen health systems to control antibiotic use. So judicious use of antibiotics is important. The animal industry is also critically important, because use of antibiotics in the animal industry drives antimicrobial resistance. And then finally, you of course need new and better drugs. And there's been a very dry pipeline around antibiotics for a very long period of time, because most people thought we've got all the antibiotics we need. And these highly resistant organisms that we just read about in the US recently, they still are quite rare, so the market's small. So we need some other global. I put it in the same bucket as almost as developing a vaccine for Ebola or Zika, where there may not be a big market, but we need some level of global responsibility to invest in it. And although companies are now moving to develop newer antibiotics, there needs to be some incentives around doing it.
Yeah, it's one of the situations where a pure capitalist model driven by short-term profits can't do the job, and we need to have strategies global strategies to actually provide resources for more research in this. The Gates Foundation has done some of that. We have enormous problem, for instance, in South Africa, where you've got a lot of HIV, which is immunosuppressive because not everybody's getting drugs, and drug-resistant TB, for instance. Now, it used to be that antibiotic resistance in hospitals often was what we call a nosocomial disease, was often contracted in hospitals, maybe even emerged there. Now, these bugs are coming in from outside, and particularly from farming-type regions. In fact, in the Netherlands, if a pig farmer comes down with a bacterial disease, they don't even admit them to the hospital where other patients are. They keep them separate for that reason. We need to get away from antibiotics and animal feeds, and it's not just cattle and pigs and so forth. It's also marine use. It's used a lot in aquaculture.
My name's Kevin Norbury. I'm a freelance journalist, formerly The Age. I know this is a serious subject, but I'm going to be a little facetious here, and you might shoot me down in flames. I expect to be. But I had an elderly aunt years ago who took Beck's pills every morning of her life, just in case. Now, she died of old age, well into her 80s.
Yeah.
She didn't have cancer, she didn't have any of these other diseases that we have now. Do you think if you brought back Beck's pills, that might solve a couple of problems?
Well, if she'd taken Vincent's APC, she would have died from kidney disease years ago. But I don't know, has the experiment been done?
Hey, my name is Edward. I'm with Minter Ellison. I just had a question about PrEP, which you mentioned. I heard there's a bit of criticism about maybe it leading to complacency with safe sexual practice and maybe drug-resistant HIV. In light of that, do you think the approval by the TGA might have been premature?
There are a few loaded arguments around PrEP because people question why do you need the additional antiviral if you can prevent transmission with a condom. And I see it exactly like the pill. You know, why do you need the pill? You can prevent pregnancy with the condom, but the pill revolutionised a way that people can control or choose to become when they become pregnant. And I think it's exactly the same way with PrEP. We know that extra intervention actually reduces your chance of getting HIV by 86%. Will it lead to more unsafe sexual behaviour? Actually, the pilot studies do show that, meaning that we do see increases in sexually transmitted infections. But when you're giving someone PrEP, they're engaged in healthcare, which means they're getting regularly tested and regularly treated. And I think that's the way to to engage people in healthcare and identify the issues. One of the big questions, I think it works, it's been shown in countless studies. The big question will be, can we afford it? That's what, I don't think the TGA just says, we can use this drug for that indication. There's no question about the use of Truvada for PrEP. It's been shown at the best level of scientific evidence to work. The big question for us in Australia with a pretty well-funded but challenged public health system is, can we afford to fund it? But the cost effectiveness analyses are very favourable because most people don't take PrEP forever. It's only for a period of time where they may be engaging in more sexual activity. It doesn't last for most people for 40 years. It lasts, people move in and out of times of risk of acquiring sexually transmitted infections. And if you do the economic evaluation, the investment to prevent infection way outweighs the consequences of managing HIV lifelong. So I think those are the sort of arguments that the PBS will look at. I do think our PBS has got a really sensible approach to how we fund drugs, because we can't fund everything in Australia. We do have a limited pool of funds, but I think the big issue will be around the economics of PrEP.
In Africa, quite a while back, where the mining companies were having a tremendous problem with HIV in their workers, they were actually putting bowls of pills out on the bar because that was the phase of people at most risk. So maybe when you went to a restaurant, when they give you that little free thing, you know, with a bit of squashed pumpkin or something, maybe they could work a couple of pills in for the people they think are at risk.
Actually, the French did a study that you only had to take PrEP. It's called event-driven PrEP. So you had to just take it 2 hours before sex and 48 hours after, and it still works. So if it was with the dessert platter, it might work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jack Ripman, University of Melbourne. Peter, Sharon. I'm just curious, when we talk about the communication gap that exists sometimes between science and the public, what in your minds do you think are the stories that aren't being told right now?
Well, I guess, you know, I've tried science communication and it's really difficult. I mean, basically, and of course with the conversation, that was one of the reasons we got the conversation going and followed Andrew Jasper's lead on that to try and get a lot bit more science that was well written and readable for a general audience out there. But it's still very difficult to get people to engage with this sort of material. And if you think of the enormously dramatic things you can show, for instance, for cigarette smoking, I mean, you can show the blackened lungs, the tumours, people getting their feet amputated, and still that doesn't necessarily get through to the people you want to get through to. So I think it's extremely challenging to get that good information out. And of course, now, when you have an advocacy for, say, vaccines, you also have an advocacy for anti-vaccine, which is not based in evidence, but it still has an emotional tugs in a lot of levels. So there's also this issue of good, valid, science-based information that will run into, for instance, perceptions in a broader community, disinformation that's out on the web, and we all know about that with climate change and so forth. It's a difficult space, and I think it's very challenging for journalists as well as it's challenging for scientists. And the interface between journalists and scientists has always been difficult, where particularly you don't have a lot of specialist scientist journalists anymore, because talking to some journalist friends, basically the issue is if they don't really get the issue properly, what you tend to get is a story on the politics of the situation rather than on actually the basic science. For instance, we saw a thing about nuclear waste. I saw it on 7:30 report the other night. It's about nuclear waste, putting it in the Flinders Ranges. It featured an Aboriginal lady who was very upset and standing near some water. It didn't tell us where the waste site would be, whether the water was anywhere near the waste site, or any of the details. It just gave us a lot of emotional crap.
Hello, my name's Graham Strawn. I'm not a journalist. I have my own company called Aquitaine Products. You each mentioned Zika virus in passing, and I'm interested to know to what extent you think that it could actually become a global epidemic, which is the case that seems to be emerging in most of the media these days. But before you answer, can I just tell you, I'll come clean on why I'm asking it. I actually have a product to control mosquitoes in a non-toxic way. It's approved in 60 countries, but I just can't find a way in to the right people. And obviously from a commercial viewpoint, it's very relevant to me as to where this thing is likely to go, or if it's just going to be a little bit of a sort of a jump in the graph when the Olympics are around.
Do you want me to go? I think it's a little hard to predict about its global impact because there's still a lot of unknowns. But first of all, the Zika virus is transmitted by a particular form of mosquito that isn't present globally. So it's present across the sort of a band around the equator. And it's exactly the same distribution of, say, dengue virus, because the same mosquito will transmit dengue. And we've had an ongoing problem with dengue outbreaks across that whole area of geographical risk. So where we are in Melbourne or in cooler climates, we just don't have that mosquito there for transmission. Zika virus has been around for a long time, first identified in the 1940s in Africa and outbreaks in Polynesia. We haven't ever seen anything of this scale. We know nothing about the likelihood of reinfection or long-term immunity, for example, for Zika. And of course, the big problem with Zika is at the first descriptions in this current outbreak of its ability to cross the placenta and infect babies and cause neurological damage. So I think it's a little hard to predict. Generally, Zika is a really mild, self-limited infection. Many people are asymptomatic. The big risk is really in this setting of pregnancy. And of course, now the understanding that it can be sexually transmitted, but we still don't have a really good sense of all the men that get infected with Zika, how many of them can then go on to transmit it. I think the issue, though, of vector-borne diseases like dengue, like Zika, there's a lot of them that are transmitted by mosquitoes, is a big issue globally, probably made worse with climate change as well. And so strategies to control the mosquito population are very good ones, and there's a lot of different things happening with either insecticides or genetic modification of those mosquitoes. Zika's, I think, brought to the fore that we need to do something around vector-borne diseases in general. And if I look at the scale of impact on morbidity and mortality, dengue's been up there for a very long time. Whether Zika will become as endemic as dengue, I just don't know.
I mean, Zika's been off our west coast, in the islands there. It's been up in the north, in the islands up there for ages. It's been in the Philippines, and we haven't had any Zika in Australia at all. And in South America, the problem is you've got an enormous population. They were a virgin soil population, absolutely no immunity. So you've got a very big epidemic. But the real concern, of course, was the microcephaly in babies. And that hadn't received much attention before. And one wonders whether in some of the island states, for instance, they were doing prenatal diagnosis and actually terminating when they found that condition. And of course, South America is heavily Catholic, so that may be an issue there. So this is the real problem. It's at its worst in South America because it's come in fresh, and a lot of people will contract the disease, show no symptoms or very few symptoms, and then be immune because you get solid immunity to these viruses. So we're not at great risk from it in Australia. We could get something happening in the north, say if someone came back, they've been bitten by a mosquito, they had the virus in their blood, they're bitten by an Aedes mosquito up north, you could get some transmission. But if we got it now up north, it would be more or less like dengue, which comes in and goes again, because it just burns out. It's maintained between humans and mosquitoes. Zika is the same, and it would just burn out again.
Firstly, is it on? Thanks for letting us come. You sort of answered the question. But what do you think the global threat from Zika will be from the Olympics?
I mean, we think that it probably will have very little impact. I think if you went to Rio for the Olympics, all you would smell is insecticide as they try to kill every mosquito. I don't think you'd see a mosquito, but if I were going, I would take insect repellent, I'd wear long sleeve shirts, long trousers, and stay away from insects in general. And maybe if you stay on the beach at Rio and just drink Caprinas and whatever, it's fine. You may be too young. I think, on the other hand, I would also carry a thermometer. And if you go and your temperature goes up, I'd see a really competent infectious disease doc who knows about tropical disease.
Just while we wait for that, just a broader question to you, Peter, in terms of the way scientists are perceived by the community and the way science is reported by the media. Does it frustrate you that there's often a lot more attention focused on people who win gold medals at the Olympics or Brownlow medals versus people who say, win the Nobel Prize?
Well, my brief experience of having won the Nobel Prize, which I've only done once, is basically the sooner the media gets off your back, the better. I mean, being a celebrity, even, the level of celebrity of winning a Nobel Prize in Australia is like being a minor figure in a coffee commercial that hasn't aired for 5 or 6 years. Even that level of celebrity is kind of annoying. And I think being a celebrity would be hideous. And I actually feel sorry for our politicians. You know, politicians, as they say, politics is celebrity for ugly people, but even ugly people shouldn't be punished in that way.
Hi, me? Yeah, hi. My name is Anna Troyce, and I'm not in the media, and I'm not a scientist. I'm just a concerned mum. There's been, a prevalence of, diseases that have come to light in the media. You know, I watch telly at night with the family and the kids, and there's, the Zika, and there's the swine flu, and the bird flu, and this flu, and that flu. In your opinion, are there more diseases that are becoming discovered today than there were, in the last, say, 30, 40 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely.
Certainly, and as a consequence of, we are seeing greater frequency of these new infectious diseases, no doubt about that, but also the reporting is far more immediate, and knowing what's happening across the globe is far easier now than it would have been decades ago. There's no doubt that infectious diseases generate a certain nervousness and at times hysteria, because of this risk that you can just catch something, not out of your control. So it generates a little bit more, and often sometimes misplaced hysteria of what someone's risk really is. And I think that's why we see it on the front page and hear about it so much. If you think about it, Peter just explained Zika. We have had a few cases of Zika diagnosed in Australia, but they're all in people that have returned from endemic countries. There's no local transmission of Zika, but yet we read about it on the front page.
There's another virus circulating, somewhat related, called chikungunya, which has caused enormous medical problems in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, right up into Italy. We've had cases come in who've contracted it, say, in Bali, but we haven't had spread here. It's almost identical, actually, to our Ross River infection. So there are these things happening all the time. But if you'd asked me 15 years ago what viruses are carried by fruit bats, I would have said none that are of human problem. The only viruses we knew of that were carried by bats were actually what we call the lyssaviruses, the rabies-like viruses, South American bats. Actually, we did know fruit bats carried lyssavirus, and we had occasional deaths here. But since then, we've had SARS, we've had Middle Eastern Respiratory Syncytial, we've had Nipah virus in Southeast Asia, we've had Hendra virus in Queensland. We now know Ebola virus is carried by fruit bats, and so forth. So there are all sorts of infections out there that we hadn't detected previously, and we now detect them because our science is a hell of a lot better, and because our diagnostics are better, and our diagnostics and science. When SARS first emerged, I think 2002, now it took about 2 or 3 months for us to isolate that virus. When the 1918 influenza virus happened, in the epidemic that killed 50 million people, it took another 15 years before we isolated the first influenza virus. So we went from 15 years to 3 months. Now we do it in 3 weeks with modern diagnosis that have emerged over the last 10 years. And the other thing is, of course, there are so many more of us. I mean, the world's population has probably increased about 3-fold since I was born. And we are moving around so much. And so dengue virus was almost restricted to Southeast Asia, that region, after the Second World War. Now it's everywhere in all the tropical regions. These viruses get around. They get around in us, and they get around possibly in sort of products that we're shipping. But the diseases are getting around very, very, very rapidly. So any substantial infectious disease, especially if it's spread by the respiratory route, is quickly global.
I just make one sort of more positive point, maybe because we're coming to the end, is that we've also seen a lot of infectious diseases disappear. And that's largely through effective vaccination. So one example, when I was training as a doctor, you would see meningitis and Haemophilus. Then there was a Haemophilus vaccine. We hardly ever see meningitis now. So we don't hardly ever see measles or diphtheria or a whole lot of infectious diseases that were very common before vaccination. So, we may even see the end of, HIV and hepatitis C, as I spoke about before. So we do have, that investment in ways to prevent these new infections is really critical, because we have seen diseases disappear as well.
You know, if I hadn't had whooping cough as a kid, I would undoubtedly have been a footy star. But basically, I mean, we've eliminated smallpox completely. The only other virus we've eliminated completely is rinderpest in cattle, very closely related to measles. We could eliminate measles virus, we could eliminate whooping cough if people would only vaccinate their kids.
Okay, could I ask one more question? Sorry, is that okay? That leads me to this other question that I have. I've got 2 small children, and my sister and my brother-in-law are both pharmacists. And they call me, well, not anymore, but they used to call me helicopter mum, because I'd always be, hovering around my kids, don't touch this, clean your hands, wash your hands, don't touch the dirt, whatever. And my sister is always saying to me, Anna, let them eat some dirt.
Yeah.
What's your opinion?
Absolutely. Dirt's very good. I mean, we've been dosing kids with worm eggs experimentally because they're not getting enough environmental exposure. It's not a bad thing to let the kids be a bit dirty, actually.
We've got time for maybe one more question.
Yep.
You have to turn it on.
How much research do you do on vectors rather than actual people?
Wonderful Australian research on vectors. The research team at Monash University that's developed Wolbachia. This is a bug that infects mosquitoes and stops it multiplying all these viruses. Doesn't kill the mosquitoes, so it gets transmitted between the mosquitoes. There's a whole lot of work on making genetically engineered mosquitoes. Where that runs into problems is because countries, because of the big green press saying GM foods are going to kill us, which is complete nonsense, they all have strict legislation on releasing GM products. So they can't release the GM mosquitoes to combat Zika. And so it's a sort of an untoward consequence, if you like. You know in science that the path to hell is paved with unexpected consequences, basically. And
Thank you very much. That's where we'll have to wrap up, because it's 2 o'clock and we've got to go back to work or whatever we're doing. I know that everybody in this room, be you a journalist or a real person, will leave instantly smarter as a result of both of you. So thank you. Thank you, Peter. I know several people from the ABC going to Rio for the Games. I'll pass on your helpful advice.
Mosquito repellent. They should smell so strongly that no mosquito or any other person will go near them.
And condoms too.
And condoms. And thank you for your explanation of event-based sexual disease treatments. Can't wait to tell my friends. Can I just say, if you are interested in what Sharon and Peter have said, firstly, I believe Peter has a very entertaining Twitter account. This is just a snapshot of the stuff he tweets apparently every day. What's your address, Peter? Do you know offhand?
It's at Prof. PC Doherty. I should warn you, it's mainly hostile to conservatives and neoliberals.
You know where to find him. And Sharon, in terms of having been through the Peter Doherty Institute on a personally guided tour in Sharon's instance, can I highly recommend, if you are interested in going to the website in the first instance, or if you don't do public tours, I think you should, because you do some fantastic work there as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Peter Doherty and Sharon Lewin. Thank you very much.